The theme for today's technology forum is how can we sustain digital scholarship, a tripartite dialogue. We are honored to have 3 experts representing key stakeholders in digital scholarship, namely scholars, librarians, and vendors, to address current practices, technical issues, and future plans for digital preservation and sustainability, and to reflect the impact of COVID-19 on digital scholarship. The program consists of 3 parts. First, we'll have 3 short presentations by our guest speakers. The first speaker, Ruth Marston, is Associate Professor of History and Director of the World History Center at the University of Pittsburgh. She is the Principal Investigator of the World Historical Gazetteer. She is the author of Dividing the Realm in Order to Govern, the Spatial Organization of the Song State, 160 to 2076, and the forthcoming The Yellow River, a Natural and an Unnatural History. And she's the co-editor of Placing Names, Enriching and Integrating Gazetteers. She has been founded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Science Foundation, the American Council of Learning Societies, and other agencies. Her title is A Teacher Scholar's View for a presentation. The second speaker, Bill Comstock, is Head of Imaging Services in Digital Strategies and Innovation at the Harvard Library. He directs the technical development and delivery of an integrated suite of services in the department. Bill is an advocate for the preservation of cultural resources, equitable and open access to information, and for the proposition that the research libraries are ideally situated to foster new modes of inquiry and the emergence of computational scholarship. Before coming to Harvard, Bill served as production manager at the MIT libraries. His presentation title is Durable Digital Resources. The third speaker, Robert Lee, is Director of Strategic Partnerships at Eastview Information Services. For over 25 years, Robert has worked with some of the most prominent archives and libraries to execute digital preservation and publishing projects. Robert has worked extensively in the United States, Europe, Latin America, Russia, and throughout East Asia. Most recently, Robert has worked on library projects in Afghanistan, Cuba, and Iran. Robert holds a master's degree in Russian translation from Columbia University and has also studied and resided in the Soviet Union. His presentation title is 2021, Holy Cow. The second part of the program is a moderated tripartite dialogue session with the speakers. The moderator is our committee member, Anning Yang, East Asian Studies librarian with the University of Wisconsin-Madison. The dialogue session intends to allow speakers representing key stakeholders in digital scholarship to better understand each other's roles and to inspire greater cooperation in the future. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the program. Please join me in welcoming our speakers to the forum.
Chang, for that kind introduction, and also for your invitation for me to attend this session. I think often about the fact that I could not do any of the scholarship that I do, whether it is traditional historical scholarship or digital scholarship, without collaborating with librarians. So I'm so grateful to have this chance to join this dialogue. So I wanted to start with the proposition that sustainability is a kind of scholarship, and sustainability needs to be embedded in the scholarly life cycle. And here I am referencing the work of one of my colleagues at the University of Pittsburgh, Allison Langmead, who had an initiative on exactly this topic. And I want to draw attention here on this screenshot from her website that sustainability is a socio-technical project. That is to say that it needs to be both of those things at once. The sustainability for digital projects absolutely has a technical component, and it also equally has a social component and an institutional component, and that at the very earliest stages of planning digital projects, it's important to integrate both of those things together. And in the project that my colleague Allison developed, essentially what she developed with this, this NEH-funded project was really a series of surveys stepping through each stage of the life cycle of a digital project. So for instance, this is an answer, this is a module within her series of surveys on the question, how long do you want your project to last? Right? There are sustainability decisions that are absolutely reliant on an answer to that question. And that question is a question about research and pedagogy. It's not something that exists outside the project, it's embedded in the project. And so, for instance, here on this screenshot that I provided, she gives an example of one project that is only supposed to last a short number of years, a different project that's supposed to last longer than 3 years, but ultimately is intended from the beginning to be retired, and then projects that are intended to be ongoing, sort of to exist, growing and in perpetuity forever. Each of those naturally is something that requires a different approach to sustainability, and those are things that the authors of those projects, this is something that can only occur in a dialogue between librarians, scholars, teachers, right? This is an example of why this idea of a tripartite dialogue is something that needs to be fundamentally embedded in all of project planning from the very beginning. I think it's pretty common from the scholarly point of view for people to build digital projects for their classrooms, for their scholarship, and then at the end sort of turn to the library and say, okay, now you have to solve sustainability for me. And that's just not ever going to be how it makes sense. So I really appreciate this work that my colleague Allison did to just sort of attune faculty, teachers, and authors to the fact that this is something that needs to be under consideration from the very beginning of their activities. Another aspect of sustainability is that it's an institutional practice, right? So it is, so what I just focused on was the fact that it's a scholarly and pedagogical practice. It's also something that needs to be shared among everybody in and beyond the university. And so I really like, this is from a project at Virginia Tech about sustainability for digital projects, the Virginia Tech University Libraries, and that we really haven't solved this. And this is very, very clear to me as somebody who has developed digital projects of a range of sizes, ranging from sort of my individual scale scholarship on up through things that are really infrastructural in scope, is that there are a lot of things at universities that fall between the cracks, right? They're not something that scholar authors are doing themselves. They're not something that libraries are doing. They're not something that IT departments are doing, or high performance computer labs or digital humanities labs, right? Because this is a new mode of scholarly communication, our institutions really just haven't quite caught up with it. And so the thing I want to focus on here is what is it that needs to be sustained? Code and content, community and staff, funding, server space and web accessibility, and more. And each of these things requires its own different kind of a sustainability plan. And also that no one entity can do all of these things together. And so this is another reason why I really appreciate the fact that this panel is focused on how this has to be a group effort. And libraries, of course, play a role, but are not ultimately probably the place where most live and interactive projects are likely to be situated. And so from there, I'll segue to a brief discussion of the project that is currently on my front burner, my digital project, which is called the World Historical Gazetteer. You can see the URL here. You can go explore it on your own. I don't have time to do an introduction to it from scratch, but this is basically a large-scale project. It has more than 1 million historical place names already. It's distributed, it's growing. We have dozens of data sets. This is a sustainability challenge in all the different ways that I'm talking about. The library is going to be playing a role in all of that, absolutely, for storing the index, for ensuring that the index, and the index is our collection of this, 2 million place names and growing, that's going to be visible as an object in a library catalog, visible through search results, available as a citable scholarly work. But that's just one aspect of what the whole World Historical Gazetteer project is about. And so we need to seek other pieces of sustainability solutions elsewhere. One example of that is that all of our code is posted on GitHub. You can see a snapshot of our GitHub page on the left. Another aspect of it is that this is a linked open data project. And so that means that, that it allows for redistribution, forking, remixing. It means it's part of a community that all together shares an interest in ensuring the sustainability of the project in all of its various dimensions. And I'm just here calling out the community that the World Historical Gazetteer is part of the Pelagios Network, which is a project to sort of a large distributed network of people, librarians and scholars and developers interested in linked data about the past, and also part of the Linked Pasts community, which is devoted to people who are interested in figuring out how to use linked open data methodologies in order to ensure that all of this content gets shared together. Right, and then finally, one of the things that our developer, I should say, I am not the developer. I'm sort of responsible for the scholarly side of that project. I'm working with a fantastic colleague and collaborator and developer named Carl Grossner, who is our development director, has a PhD in geography. And one of the things that he's working on right now is containerizing the software. Basically, if you see this graphic on the top, moving the software behind the World Historical Gazetteer from the development phase where it sits sort of always open on his computer into something that can be operationalized, moved around, and become portable to any other entity that wants to host a part of this project. So basically, all of that is to say, just to reinforce the point I started with, which is that there's not one single sustainability solution. It's always something where projects need to be distributed among their parts, different pieces getting sustained in different ways, and with decisions about that, integrated into the very earliest stages of planning. The final point I want to make, and here I'm just showing images of a couple of my books, is that books are a really great sustainability platform, right? They've developed over I guess the codex is about 1,500 years old. It's fantastic, it's stable, it never goes down. Libraries know how to hold books sustainably. Universities know what to do with books and also with journal articles. And I think it's really important, even for those of us who are doing kind of next generation type, brand new development projects for scholarship and pedagogy, to recognize that it's likely that those projects at some point will cease to exist, but the books and articles that we write about them are what will live on for decades and centuries and beyond. That's really what we know how to do, and I think it's really important that our projects include that as well. So thank you all so very much for your time, and thank you again for inviting me to participate.
First, thank you for having me here today. I'm here, my part in this group is to represent the technical perspective, which comes from managing a group of people that are endeavoring to digitize library resources and to create enduring digital objects for Harvard Library that are hopefully shared far beyond the gates of Harvard. The points that I'm going to try and address are things that I think are important, obviously, but also things that, in working with colleagues to get digital information that comes from outside the university into our systems, are issues that are sometimes neglected, and to also highlight some of the approaches that we take in trying to make sure that things that we're making when we're digitizing resources make them more sustainable. So as Ruth is in the scholarship business, and just at the end of her presentation mentioned how eventually some of these digital humanities sites may go away, but the scholarship they produce is the lasting, maybe the lasting thing. We're in the business of making resources that fuel the efforts of Ruth and other scholars long into the future. At least that's our hope. So, start off simply because it helps me think. So where do digital resources come from? So in my department, of course, we make them. We make them by handling and working with analog source material that we want to make more accessible. And increasingly, we collect them. So the collage that you see there is a collection of images of European protest movements that are being collected right now. And this is undoubtedly going to be a dominating stream of acquired content that comes into the library. And part of the reason that it comes through the department that I manage is because we can handle it in much the same way that we handle the resources that we produce ourselves, and stream them into the repository where they're stored and managed over time, link them to catalog records, and provide those same access points that we do for the things that we work on in-house digitizing analog materials that Harvard collects. And of course, we rent them. These are licensed resources, and these are not my bag, and I'm not going to talk about these. So what makes a digital resource durable? And lots of things can, but a few that I'm going to highlight, some of them aren't technical. You know, if it's a resource that the library owns or has possession of and can control, that certainly is helpful. The resource has to be findable. It really has to be usable. It really has to be citable, and ideally it's replicated. So what I mean is, you know, lacking rights to reformat or save or secure a resource for the future makes the resource more fragile. So when we actually take possession of digital resources, we're in a position where we can monitor the systems that are available to us to make these objects renderable to the communities we're trying to serve, and also to transform them and make them accessible at endpoints on the network over time that are the ones that are amenable to new forms of scholarly inquiry. So we can let the scholars get at them in the way that is most suitable for the kind of research they're doing over time. Findable, you know, how is it described? Where is the description? You know, this is simple, but, you know, there are certainly things that come in that, well, where is it described? The description may exist originally in a spreadsheet, or it may exist in a very local database. So it may exist initially in not a standards-based descriptive catalog. It's also helpful, gets even more helpful if the place where it's described is broadly accessible, even more helpful if it's broadly aggregated, and even better if it's crawled and the results show up in places like Google. Usable, can it be rendered with a set of features that researchers need? Can it be reconfigured to meet future needs? And is it citable? Is the endpoint online something that is ephemeral, where the reference is linked to a system that may go away over time, or is it a persistent URL, a system that can survive changes in underlying infrastructure and still be something that people can access? And of course, you know, having items that where the rights and the infrastructure support people being able to use them outside the context in which we originally provide them to our users and allows them to be replicated, increases their durability. So some of those things that I mentioned aren't technical at all. You know, typically the thing people think that we'll talk about and are very important is, you know, are you making these things in the right formats and are they in the right standards? But I think talking about some of these other things about, are they usable, are they findable? These are the things that make them vital library resources, and having resources that have vitality, they can be used for lots of purposes in different ways over long periods of time, increase the likelihood that the organizations that support them will continue to support them. So the digital resources we collect, this is kind of a new area for my group, and it's fascinating. And this is where I'm going to make my big pitch for the importance of file format expertise. The importance of knowing the information that a file carries. And the importance here is that we don't lose information that comes in that is not understood to be there when these resources are collected. And there are also serious ethical implications for privacy and the safety of those depicted in the images. So images are more than imagery. So the picture that you see on the left is the imagery. Typically when images are collected for libraries, this is the resource, this is the significant properties that the researcher is thinking that they're collecting and communicating. But whether it's an image file or a video file or a document file, we need to think of these as bundles of data. So this is one example. So this photograph that I show on the side of the slide, I can peer inside it and I can see that this is the camera that produced it. So this can tell you things. This camera probably cost around $2,000 when it was originally purchased. So someone may have been a fairly serious photographer who collected this originally. The shutter count is 238,000 images. So this is probably a professional photographer or someone who has kept that camera very, very busy. It even includes the serial number of the camera. You could go back to Sony and probably trace it back to the owner if the owner had registered the camera. You can tell the focal length of the camera and get a good sense of how far away the person was that made the photograph. Of course, you know what date it was photographed on. And, you know, most importantly, you know exactly where it was photographed. So it was photographed here. You can trace that back onto a map. You can see where the photographers probably stood. And when I've got 1 minute left. So when you're considering ways of providing access to the photographs, typically librarians will think about, well, do I have the consent of the photographer because the photographer carries the copyright? But increasingly, I think, particularly in these cases, we have to also think about the consent of those who are depicted in the photograph, not as a factor that will automatically send us to, yes, we can make it accessible, or no, we can't, but to consider how broad the access should be. Can we anticipate that there are negative consequences for the people depicted or for the photographer? And what are those consequences? Are they legal? Are they social? Are they the consequences that would put the person at the risk of violence? So these are all really interesting considerations. And collecting is more than saving. Now I'm going to fly through my slides here. This is just a pitch to make sure that when files are collected, that one of the most important things we need to do is to try and organize them in the way we name them and the way we structure them in file systems so that when they're processed downstream, they can be linked to the descriptive records that people are thinking of. So if you hand someone like me a big bag of files that you can't understand once they're deposited what they relate to, it creates a mess. So summary, digital information is fragile. Significant resources and expertise are needed to keep any single copy of a resource alive. And digital information is robust. replication of digital resources and its descriptions is another good guard against human and organizational failure. And I will stop, but my pandemic extra, which I was asked to add here, is that I'm really hoping that the pandemic really pushed along the idea of controlled digital lending, which would, if we can master a system for digitizing copyright protected resources and loaning them out in the way we did with traditional books, it will really transform what we can digitize and share. And of course, this is from the Authors Guild site saying that controlled digital lending is neither controlled nor legal. So even though we've sped closer towards this goal, we've sped right to the precipice where we have to fight it out, I think. Thanks.
Thank you to the committee for creating this digital space today. Pleased to be here, but we'll of course be very much happier to join you in person in Honolulu next year. Well, no one will be surprised if I comment that it's been a lousy year, last 13, 14 months of disruption for everybody. There are a couple takeaways here. The disruption has thrown a spotlight on two major realities of how we all work together. Vendors, scholars, librarians, everyone associated. The high degree of dependence on digital resources and the impact of a wide-ranging disaster. We all know what happens when there's a flood in some state or a financial crisis for an institution, but here's the first time that we see what happens when it's system-wide. In the COVID environment, libraries faced supply chain interruption, of course, in print, but also a scramble as everyone rushed to e-resources, e-books, e-journals, to compensate for a lack of access to physical collections. So one major takeaway, as I think Bill also just touched on, is recognizing the fragility of access channels and how we might look at that going forward for online resources. The COVID is not the only big shift, however. There have been other shifts occurring. The usual paradigms have been evolving pretty rapidly, and old models have been highly disrupted. Scholars' access to data is no longer bound by print books and collections, and not even just by the e-resources that they have access to. If you will forgive the analogy, the day of the tea bag is past, and scholars have really found out that there's a tea field out there. And the entrepreneurial and curious scholars are now really interested in harvesting from many different tea fields in really new ways, not just the platforms that they've been accustomed to. Traditionally, that e-resource model has been presentation of content, whether in an open access project or a commercial presentation on a specific platform with a specifically curated set of content that has certain technical features and boundaries, and beyond just the technical boundaries of a platform that always comes with certain licensing boundaries and business rules and things that nobody really loves. Publishers love platforms. Scholars, not so much. Maybe librarians, not so much. For scholars, at the end of the day, it's about just what content is going to get them the answers to meet their research goals. And we understand that, of course. I'm confident that everybody who's in the session today is coming from a campus where in recent years a new body has been formed, a digital humanities lab or a data visualization studio or a digital objects workshop, or all the different names that they come by. Some of those are integrated into your libraries, and some of them act maybe even frustratingly independently. And maybe some of you have administrations with very clear, well-funded visions for that. And in other cases, maybe there's a lot of improvisation and scrambling going on. But it's all a clear reflection of where scholarship is going. And what used to be very heavily an aspect of the sciences, the hard sciences, is now really prevalent in the humanities as well. And I think for East Asian studies, this will be very prominent. But the main thing here is the requested data could come from anywhere. The student has an idea and a dream, maybe a vague idea, and it leaves a bit of scrambling about how to get that data for them. Before I get on to quick notes on specific kinds of projects we've been involved in, I just want to say that the series of tasks that happen in getting data for a scholar span from licensing to technical provisioning, things that both Ruth and Bill touched on. And we find ourselves as a vendor very often in a consultative role. So somebody knows they need to get something done, they just don't know how. And we're often just by default in a position of presenting a range of potential solutions and questions to mitigate. And it's not just the scholars or the libraries that we find ourselves advising. A lot of this has to do with advocacy, education, and diplomacy on the source side. Publishers are not generally comfortable with the idea of just giving up their raw content unprotected, especially in an environment where these things are not yet well defined. So some quick notes on just some types of projects that we've been supporting. Well, in academic space, the most early frequent TDM and projects that we've been requested to take part in have been focused on newspapers. And that's really unsurprising given the inherent interdisciplinary nature of newspapers. The sheer quantity and coverage of newspapers, what's been digitized, and the fact that a lot of it is out of copyright content. Some recent examples have been mining of images from Japanese newspapers to test Google image search cultural bias, for example. If there's a specific type of furniture or cultural object in a Japanese context, will Google understand that? How do you teach Google to have sort of equal cultural understanding? Other projects have involved giving an undergraduate raw access to 150 million pages of Chinese newspaper content to digitally read in 2 weeks and produce analysis of modern Chinese press coverage of certain piquant topics. Most of you, all of you, I presume, are familiar with Dr. Boll's work at Harvard, the China Bibliographical Database Project. Behind the scenes, Eastview is pleased to help support that project by making tens of thousands of Difangzhi available in digital format. And obviously, the output of the CBDB involves reconstructing this rich network of Chinese court officials and government actors across all of Chinese history. To make that possible, required obtaining content from commercial providers, libraries such as the National Library in China, digitizing from print, creating text, and homogenizing technical formats across all of these different sources. If there's one takeaway about these kind of projects, it really has to be the sum, or the total, is greater than the sum of the parts. What we can do with these diverse off-platform mixes is so much more powerful than what we can do when we're bound to the original sources or even online platforms of one stripe or another. Our deepest experience, typically at Eastview, has been for quite some time doing mass data feeds in the government, not the academic sector. And a lot of that is focused on journals and scientific research. The scale of those projects is astounding, and so are the types of research outcomes that are possible. We can crunch decades and decades and decades and tens of millions of articles to see patterns and drive conclusions based on artificial intelligence. It's, again, the mass, the scale, the variety, and the flexibility of an off-platform application that makes the research more powerful by orders of magnitude. This past summer, we were able to work with the Allen Institute, providing mass quantities of scientific literature from China in their effort towards an artificial intelligence analysis to try to jumpstart US research on a COVID vaccine. Chinese data was of particular importance for the project, not just because the first wave of COVID originated in China, but because of China's decades of previous engagement with coronavirus outbreaks, including SARS, and also because a prevailing feature of Chinese data is the breathtaking scale and depth of the available scientific literature, and the very proactive way in which Chinese producers have richly tagged their data. It makes it just an optimal case for digital exploitation, particularly in an off-platform environment. What's clearest to me, and I think to scholars, is just really these new appetites. We know, I'm sure all of you get questions that nobody would have anticipated 5 years ago because of technical limitations of what people want to do. So many questions now about how to do it. And for this audience, where does that leave a librarian? One could say that the digital cart is getting quite ahead of the digital ox. The principal questions that we're wrestling with right now and are eager to dialogue with our librarian counterparts is how this data gets archived in the future. How can harvested data serve many, not just the principal investigator for a single project? How can it be made financially sustainable? How can it be made repeatable to make these sorts of data experiments academically valid? A lot of these projects are grant funded and driven by individuals. And just the nature of this bespoke kind of work of convincing publishers or others, gathering from other sources to format data in bespoke ways requires a lot of bespoke work. It's not a commodity thing yet. And so really our ear to the ground and our invitation to librarians is to better understand how can entities such as EastU better partner with you to solve problems on behalf of your scholars. We're very sympathetic to the position this leaves librarians in, and we're on the frontier with you. With that, thank you again for the time and look forward to our discussion.
Thanks for all of the speakers talk about this excellent presentation. And it is our time to start our tripartite dialogue. So please feel free to share your ideas and thoughts in this part. And I would like to motivate the conversation with a very general question, like after listening to each other's presentation on the digital scholarship sustainability, do you think the three stakeholders in digital scholarships, that is scholars, librarians, and vendors, are on the same page? Or if you wanted to share, like, did you learn anything new or surprising from each other in terms of practice and plans for digital presentation and sustainability?
So I want to thank Bill and Robert for their excellent presentations, and it definitely sort of reinforced to me that having a conversation like the one that we are, bringing vendors and scholars and librarians into the same room is really important. And I was particularly reflecting on Bill's presentation about the importance of durability, findability, and visibility. That is, the things that libraries can collect and can be responsibly have an expectation that they're going to be able to continue to do their excellent and professional work with, having collected, are things that have those characteristics of durability, findability, and visibility. And durability in particular, is what I was mulling over as I was listening to him, thinking how many of the things that I create that are individual scholar scale projects, that are grant driven, that are driven by grants that are supposed to be demonstrating that I'm doing something that's sort of cutting edge digital research, right? That those things are sort of the opposite of durable in a way, right? They're sort of and in a way, maybe to overstate the case a little bit, they're supposed to be the opposite of durable. That is, the data itself. I mean, sure, I can create a tab delimited file, and expect that a university repository will be able to handle that, but an entire package that includes sort of live and evolving code isn't something that a library can accession, nor should they, nor would they want to. And so I think that's the really interesting, I guess in a way we are on the same page, if what I mean by that is that I have an understanding of where library responsibility appropriately stops and where something else needs to start, but what that something else isn't happening. So maybe I think maybe a way to summarize this is to say we're all on the same page, but as one another, but we may not be on the same page collectively as our deans and provosts.
So thanks for sharing. So how about Bill? So after you hear from the rules description, so do you have any ideas?
I was thinking something very similar. You know, the three of us were all talking about how we are dependent on each other. And I think while we recognize that, I think in practice, we as representatives of various groups, we haven't closed the loop to do the things that we all recognize need to be done. So one of the examples I gave was, you know, quickly, as I was running out of time, was, you know, if someone presents us with a pile of data that they've collected. So there was a project where images were collected on a certain topic, and there wasn't any advanced consultations in terms of the way that they were, my cat's here now, the way that they were named or organized. And that made it very difficult for the library to collect those. And it created a lot of work that could have been bypassed if we'd only spent a little bit of time doing the things that I think the three of us recognize ought to be done, which is just coordinating. And sometimes that's really the hardest thing to do, is to recognize when you need each other and to take the extra time, sometimes too much extra time it takes to reach out and kind of negotiate some of these things in advance.
Yeah, thanks for your sharing. So Robert, as a vendor, so do you have any ideas to support rules and the bills requirement?
I do. I think, well, first of all, I'm very fortunate to be representing the specific vendor I do, because my perspective, if I were from Elsevier or somebody else who's owning the content, might be pretty different. As most of you know, EastU, we're sort of a clearinghouse for other people's content. And so it puts us in a position to be a bit more flexible about finding solutions. Yeah, we completely embrace, I mean, we depend on scholars to point us in the direction of what they need. Often our work involves extending what a university has done with their own converted content, or finding a partnership with a campus to be the end repository, a trusted repository for something. It's a whole ecosystem. We can be in a bit of an awkward position sometimes because we're a private entity. So source publishers might not trust us as much as a broader academic community who is using and vouching for us, or maybe serving as a trusted repository. Universities may feel the same. We're sort of just a solution network, basically, between these different parties.
Thank you. So after we talked about these things, so do you have any new idea about the corporation or something like that?
If you're asking me personally, we are very interested in workshopping things like digital environments in which somebody can interact with digital content, bring their own tools, or stand up very standardized baseline tools, sort of a digital escrow, as it were. We often find on the sourcing side that when we're talking about proprietary content, it's very difficult or sometimes impossible for a publisher just to give it up, especially if they know it's like in the hands of an undergraduate, or they feel that giving their unprotected content will lead to 1 million unsanctioned copies or creating commercial problems for them. So that's kind of a blind spot, I think, in the paradigm right now. You know, where's a safe space for people to encounter content? I always think of my own past work as a researcher. You know, if I went to the Beinecke at Yale, nobody's going to let me walk out with rare documents. I'm going to sit in a controlled space. I'm not going to bring in food. I'm not going to bring in ink. I'm going to be under observation. I'm going to be able to access the content in a controlled, responsible way, and I'm going to be able to walk out of the Beinecke with conclusions, but not with compromising the content itself. And I think we kind of need a digital paradigm for that.
Thank you. So how about Bill and Ruth? Do you find anything we could do like the cooperation in the future?
Yeah, I really like what Robert suggested about this sort of digital escrow idea. And what I was thinking as he was talking is that what the three of us have in common, one of the many things we have in common, is that we are all aggregators, right? So in the World Historical Gazetteer project that I talked about, our vision and what we're accomplishing is to index specialist content by many, many different contributors. And a library, of course, and I really like Bill's example with the images, right, is also an aggregator of, I mean, that's what a library is, right, is a place that brings together, you know, millions of different pieces of content authored by different people. And that's what a publisher is as well, a vendor. And Eastview in particular, it was a great presentation. And so I'm sort of thinking out loud here, but the question is, if we sort of disaggregate ourselves from our roles, that is as vendor, librarian, and scholar, and instead think about the fact that we have a thing that all of us are doing in our disparate roles, which is bringing together multiplicities of content. And in a sense, I mean, I kind of provocatively said, you know, books are great platforms also. And of course, what is a scholarly book except something that carries a bibliography and footnotes also from hundreds of different sources? And so if we think at a really abstract level about the thing that we're all doing, it's aggregating knowledge, right? It's sort of aggregating and then remixing knowledge. And I wonder if there would be fruitful ways to think about collaboration if instead of thinking of ourselves as being situated in different kinds of institutions in a scholarly ecosystem, we start by saying, here's a thing that we're all doing, right? We all have this common goal and vision of aggregation. What can we do to all do that work more effectively?
Thank you. So Bill, so from the library side.
So Harvard is a big academic library, but when Robert talks about, you know, off-platform uses of digital resources, Harvard isn't a big enough library anymore to do the kinds of things people want to do with resources. So we're still working in a model where all of these different academic libraries and even national libraries have their own collections. You know, they're in the same structures. And the best thing we could ever do is to pool our digital collections, perhaps by format type or something, so that the pools of resources that scholars can access, they don't have to go on a scavenger hunt, you know, from one institution to another. They need as many of these like resources in one place, you know, where they can run computational tools over them and they can access them. And so that would be a great thing. In some ways, HathiTrust provides some of that to libraries for published materials, but we could use that for things like newspapers. JSTOR Forum provides that to a certain extent for image collections, but that would be a great force for scholars, is to not have the scavenger hunt anymore, and we could all represent that this comes from Harvard and we can get whatever credit that we need. But that would be the best thing we could do for the scholarly community, is to not keep things to ourselves.
So it seems like Robert, you want to share something, right?
Yeah, I think, Bill, you're hinting towards a future that might involve a new area of scholarly publishing, which will be finding aids for digital mashups. Sort of meta finding aids to digital data sets.
Okay, thank you. Since we talk about cooperation, so maybe in this part, I would like to share some experience related to the COVID-19 influence in your part, such as how has the COVID-19 impacted your roles in the digital scholarship? So yeah, maybe Bill, you wanted to start?
Well, my department has traditionally worked on digitizing the things that only Harvard can share. So most of what we work on are special collections, although also published collections and serial runs and different things that we have. But we used a lot of our resources, which were diminished because of the circumstances of the pandemic, on working to make sure that students could access their readings remotely, because it was absolutely necessary for us to do that. And when the COVID crisis is over and people can attend school, you know, in person and in large groups, that thing that we've spent so much of our resources doing this year is not going to go away, nor should it. And that gets to the controlled digital lending. That's really going to, the sooner that fight is engaged, the better, because, you know, people increasingly aren't using the analog resources. If there's something that's at their digital elbow that they can use to satisfy whatever requirement that they're trying to meet, that's what they use. And when you look at the profile of what's been digitized, that leaves an awful lot of stuff out, and it's got to skew the research, you know? So I'm really hopeful that that libraries can make more of their content accessible. And if individuals can read things online in the way that they could check out books, great. But more important are the transformational uses that Google has demonstrated are legal, where we could take more of these texts and things that are published and work on them as data sets, and to help speed people along towards answering the questions they want to ask, or more importantly, telling them what questions they should be asking. And that's really exciting.
It is. So from vendor like Robert, do you have any experience related to the COVID-19 on digital scholarship? Robert, you are muted.
Oh, sorry, thank you. Yeah, again, it's a huge focal point for, you know, it's a wake up that massive financial disruption can happen, massive logistical interruption can happen. It will probably happen again, so we should rethink some things. A chief difficulty for me personally in this has been, though, the currency of my work is personal interaction. I'm trying to convince people with important content in foreign countries, often with adversarial relationships to US scholarship, principles of academic freedom, or commerce, to make their content more broadly available. And it's very hard to do that by Zoom. So being able to press the flesh again in places like Beijing is vitally important, and that's been a bit of a setback. We continue to deepen relationships that we've had for decades, but to be on the frontier and work with new institutions, you know, very difficult. So we're very eager for a return to normalcy in that regard. But during this period of stagnancy in some areas, the tech continues to enable us more strongly, and it pushes us to more plausible outcomes than we could have thought about, you know, 3 years ago or so. Also, we were encouraged by the fact that at the federal level in this country, part of the COVID response did go to libraries. So getting real about national investment strategies for digital and for libraries, which frankly gets us towards catching up to certain economies in East Asia, is actually a good thing that came out of COVID.
Thank you. So how about Ruth? Do you have any experience on it?
Yeah, well, like Robert, I deeply miss seeing students and collaborators and colleagues face to face, both in China and also right here on my campus in Pittsburgh, a place I have barely set foot on in the last year. But at the same time, one of the things that's been really heartening, and I don't know how it's going to change things going forward, but I think and hope that it does, is how much we really can do remotely, not in an ideal way necessarily, but in a way that actually works. My teaching is going well. I've been able to design classes that in which my students use only sources that are already digitized, or sources that I or my library can fairly easily scan, that are fairly limited in scope. And that works. I've been able to teach a good class that way. And over this last year, I've also been finishing a book project. I mean, been at the stage of sort of, revisions and production that typically would be a very, very library heavy kind of roaming the stacks kind of project. But between having great librarians, and I think Zhang Haihui is here in the room somewhere, and I just want to give a shout out and a deep thanks to her and her staff. Between really helpful librarians and sources that are already digitized, I've been able to get really far. Not just far, I've been able to finish this book in a way that I'm proud of without going to a library face to face. And as a really trivial example, but something, that happened just yesterday, I'm going through my page proofs. I saw a direct quote. It looked a little funny to me. And my first thought was, oh no, I know this is a book I have in my collection. I'm going to have to go to campus. I have to figure out what the rules are. What even do I do to get into my office these days? And then I realized, wait, it's just one line. I'm just going to type it into Google Books and that will call it up for me. And I did just that. And rather than having to take a trip across town to my campus, I was able to solve that problem really quickly. So, some of these new habits I hope stay with us, although others, I really wish that this session that we were having right now was in person and not over Zoom.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for Ruth's sharing. So I think it is our time to end our dialogue part. So many thanks for our speakers for sharing their thoughts with us. So the rest of time will be our Q&A part. Thank you.
I'll have the Q&A session. So Lucy, can you read the question from the chat? Well, I think we have a few questions here in the chat box.
Yes, we have quite a few interesting questions here, but I think we are running out of time, running short of time. So I'll have to pick some of these questions to ask. So the first question is from Eric. This question is for Bill. It sounds as if many of the concerns you have about digital resources are problems confronting archivists and record managers. In addition to more traditional subject librarians, do you collaborate with archivists or draw on their expertise? If yes, what expertise or resources do both parties get out of the collaboration? Bill, please. Thank you.
We definitely do. And the department that I manage is unusual in that we have librarians on staff, including archivist librarians. So part of what we do in terms of offering integrated services is there are a bunch of different systems that you have to sort of knit together into a digital resource, like which catalogs are you going to use? Are you going to use a finding aid, or are you going to use this catalog, or what delivery systems, and do you need OCR, do you need indexing? So anyway, it's a complicated and rich set of resources that we make available to people, and we actually have people on staff that work with librarians to design which of these systems they need to access, and to make sure that they have a cataloging plan that they know how to catalog, but to know to think about it through the lens of knowing where those links are going to show up and how those things are going to be aggregated. We can mark up a finding aid for people. We have excellent catalogers on staff that do original cataloging, image cataloging. And we found over time that we needed to have some of these groups within our control, because every time we take on one of these challenges on behalf of the library, it's a stone that's removed from their road. It's something that they don't have time to do, or that we can do at a lower cost because we do it all the time. So we have these folks with this kind of expertise on staff, and those folks also consult with archivists and library professionals and can speak with them with authority as peers. So it's super important to not just be the people making pictures of stuff.
Tan, how are we doing with time?
Okay, so maybe do you want to stay for 5 more minutes to answer a few questions? Okay. Okay. So Lucy, maybe pick out kind of one or two.
Okay, I really like the next question. It's from Joshua, and it's about, this question is for Robert. It's about license agreements. So license agreements usually stipulate that licensed objects can only be accessed via the proprietary systems of the publishers. However, scholars are interested in using full text and analysis tools surpassing those individual databases. I think we will need a neutral environment without the frame of provider software and their databases to make such cross-database access and cross-database analysis possible. What do you think will be the way for academics, librarians, vendors, and publishers to reach such a stage?
Yeah, I share those same thoughts and concerns exactly. The current state of licenses and the accumulated practice that way is all modeled about restricting or protecting use or protecting business models on platform, and it all has to change. The entire nature of what we're starting to get involved in academic space crosses over that boundary. All those licensing terms need to be thought about in a completely new way when you make it off platform. There isn't, of course, one standard. So when something is off platform, it's a very different thing to a publisher, whether that is just full text or rich XML. What is the time-bound dimension of this? Just as in the presentation that was cited within Ruth's presentation, they all have implications for the appropriateness and the comfort level to support different kind of licensing models. And it's all hand in hand with the tech. So if we have a clear way to demonstrate to a publisher that their content is in a way that can assuredly not incur damage to their livelihood and responsibilities, not giving them control to intermediate with what a scholar does, but a level of comfort to understand that that the rights that are being asked of them are respected and don't pose great risk to them. That's entirely what we're trying to work out. There are positive examples in that direction. We've seen examples of publishers who say, well, I'm not comfortable giving you the data, but I will take your spec and I will process the data and I will give you the output. That's kind of a recent development that's sort of interesting. But this uniform space where we say, here's where it's going to go, here's what's going to happen with it, and here's how it should be licensed is a little vague at the moment. Every project is individual. And I just will say that the more that it involves the academic community and is not just a commercial enterprise of a vendor, the higher the chance of success.
Okay, so yeah, do we have time for a third question? Okay. This question is from Lawrence for Bill. Have we gotten any better at anticipating sustainability needs, like systematic file names for bunches of data at the start of the projects, or are there any major strides that need to be made?
I don't think there are any major strides that need to be made. The only hurdle is getting people to actually ask us. There's no rocket science to it, but just have people say, what can I do? And some of the things they will have already thought of, and there'll be 3 or 4 important things that they haven't. And just ironing those things out makes the process so much easier.
Okay. So Tang, what about time?
So I think this is about the time, and then so someone said, would you consider to do more Q&A since it's not 3 p.m. yet? Okay, our speakers are okay to stay a little bit longer. Okay, so yeah, if you have questions, please put in the chat box or raise your hand. Jean, do you have anyone raise your hand?
Not at the time, but I am checking the chat box. So if there is any more questions, please feel free to put them in the chat.
Okay.
Actually, like there's a question from Julie as well. This question is for Robert. So our indexes, I think it's about the newspaper databases that Robert talks about. So our indexes being built in the digital newspaper projects, and are these easily searchable on the platform? So it's for Robert. Thank you.
Oh, well, if we're talking about off-platform projects, we don't dictate the projects. They're all unique. These are all cases of principal investigators coming to us, or sometimes a librarian or an institution coming to us saying, "This is what I'm being asked about. Here's the research goals." So, just to be clear, all aspects of what the features of these projects are, they're not designed by us. We sometimes present a range of implications. Well, you want to do this. Well, here's a path to getting there. Some of the projects are shared only among a handful of data scientists working in a work group, for instance. Other projects are more publicly available. They all take different shapes. We're a neutral party. We, of course, if the situation is more work needs to be done to do something like that, and it's part of our usefulness and livelihood to provide that work, we're of course always in favor of it. But we're not the architect of an off-platform data project like that. So we embrace it. We obviously see the utility, and we're glad to serve in that capacity if that's what our partners are wishing for us to build.
Okay, and actually I have one question to Ruth. And you mentioned like the one solution to do the sustainable digital scholarships is go through the open and linked data. So can you say a little bit more about that kind of solution?
Yeah, so I think the promise of linked data is that it means that instead of just one content developer having a stake in the sustainability of data, it means that there's a whole community of people establishing links back and forth, all of whom need that data to be sustained in order for their own projects to be successful. It's a sort of, radical degree of interoperability. And in a way, I guess the downside of that is that it means that if any one of those underpinning goes away, there are multiple different projects that are going to suffer from it. But from the point of view of institutional commitments to sustainability, I think it's really important to just distribute out the number of different institutions, all of which have a stake in feeling like everybody's data needs to be successful. And so, everybody's sustainability outcomes need to be successful. And so instead of just having one institution that feels like they are the only owners of the problem of sustainability, it means there are multiple institutions that might be the ones that ultimately are serving and migrating and cataloging that information. So it's not that linked open data literally is in itself a sustainability solution, but that I think that it's part of moving towards a world, a scholar, so much of what I think all three of us are talking about in this session is that we're sort of in movement towards some new world that hasn't quite come into being yet. And the more that different scholarly projects are linking to one another, the more that there has to be, momentum and urgency to solve some of these problems that haven't quite been fully addressed yet.
Thank you, Ruth. I think that's kind of somewhat related to Bill's thing, like linked file by format. So you have if they have universal standards like a IIIF, so like all images can be linked to one platform. Okay, we have another question. So Lucy, can you read from the chat? Lucy.
Yes.
Actually, it's only sent to me. Sorry. So I will read the question. It's a question to Ruth. There are lots of geographic name changes in China. How are you going to harvest more recent place names in your database? Geo names are very often do not have those names in their database. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And this is more sort of a question about the content and methodology of the World Historical Gazetteer than it is a sustainability question, but it's something that I love talking about. So basically, the goal of the World Historical Gazetteer is to be a repository of attestations of information about places, where all of those attestations are linked together because somebody who has uploaded a file of place name information has made a declaration that some place that they are aware of the existence of is a close match or an exact match with a place that we already know about. So for instance, if somebody is uploading a file of Mongol era information and they know about Dadu or Kanbalik, right? They can say, I think that's related to Beijing, right? I want to say that if somebody searches for Beijing, they should be finding Dadu and vice versa. And so basically that's our goal. And for China, we have on our horizon probably for the summer to ingest the China historical GIS. So that will be a great sort of kind of baseline of information about prefectures and counties throughout the imperial era, and then to just continually add to that with people's specialist projects. We've talked with the developers of the Buddhist historical geographical information from Arizona State. And so basically just sort of moving up project by project, continuing to add attestations of names we already know about and continuing to add names that we don't know about, all of which in our linked pasts format can be sort of circumscribed by when they existed, when the names existed, when the places existed, when a place had a particular feature type, and creating links between different versions of names for the same places and different people's attestations about those places.
Okay. Oh, thank you, Ruth. So I don't think we have any more questions. Okay. So Lucy, do you want to read from the?
You go ahead, Tom, then.
Oh, okay. Okay, and so it's a kind of follow-up to Ruth. And the reason I asked that question because I established a lot of China place names for NACO. Are you going to consider to include LC name authority database for place names?
Yeah, I guess at one level, the more the better. Right, for the number of sources that we want to work with. We've talked about doing something with the Library of Congress catalog with all of the different names that are embedded in MARC records. At this stage, that seems so large, right, that figuring out how to do that kind of reconciliation between the Library of Congress catalog and our existing database of place names seems challenging, but I would really love to talk about the possibilities and also about sort of interoperability between projects of large scale, perhaps via API rather than via a sort of direct ingest into our index. Some of these things we've been talking about in the session with how to use multiple tools together without having to sort of centralize everything in one particular repository. So I'd be very happy to follow up about the possibilities.